So up next is our panel on AI and deepfakes, a topic I'm sure many of you, like me, find fascinating and equally concerning. In this panel discussion, we'll explore how data journalists can take on the challenges presented by an increasingly sophisticated AI and deepfake technology. It's my pleasure to introduce our colleague from the datajournalism.com team, data editor Tara Kelly, who will be our moderator. For the panel, we're joined by Sam Gregory, project director of Witness. Also joining us is Maria Amelie, former journalist and co-founder of Factiverse, and Glyn Mottershead, senior lecturer in data journalism at City University of London. Thank you all for being here today. Looking forward to your panel. I'm very excited. So Tara, I pass it over to you.
Marvelous. Thank you, Sebastian, for that introduction. Everyone, welcome to our talk on AI and deepfakes. How can journalists know what's real? It's no secret that today's media landscape has become more chaotic and easier to manipulate. AI-generated fake videos shared across news outlets and social networks are just one form of fakery that we're seeing to undermine our democracies and spread untruths online. But not all is lost. AI technologies can also be used to detect and debunk mis- and disinformation. There are numerous tools out there that are being developed to help journalists spot and stop fakery in its tracks. Meanwhile, journalism schools and universities also have a critical role to play in helping future journalists develop a mindset in adapting to this new media environment. That's why in today's panel, we'll be exploring what journalists need to know about AI and deepfakes, along with what the solutions are out there. So to get started, I'd like to bring in Sam Gregory from Witness. Sam is an expert in this field and an AI technologist himself. And I just wonder if, Sam, you could talk to us about, deepfakes, what they are, define them for us, and perhaps show us some examples of different types of synthetic media that you're seeing out there today.
Great, thank you for the invitation to be here today. Let's kick off with this slide. And if we could play the Tom Cruise video as well, please. Can we put the audio up on the video? Seems like we might have a technical challenge on that video. So that was a very brief glimpse. Here it comes back again. So at this point, you should imagine someone who sounds like Tom Cruise speaking in a very realistic voice. So I'm going to shallow fake a deep fake of Tom Cruise at this moment so people can explain it. Let me talk through this slide and explain why I'm showing you this. So at this point, I think most people are familiar with the idea of a deep fake, right? So this is this series of techniques that have emerged from research in artificial intelligence that essentially make it easier for people to manipulate audio and video in ways that make it look like someone said or did something they didn't do, or to create an image of something that never existed. And the reason I show this slide is really to illustrate, I guess, the two extremes of deepfakes right now. One is something that probably most people in the audience may even have played with, right? Which is the kind of animate your ancestor type photo animation. So the woman on the left is my great-grandmother. And I put in one photo of her and it made her look like she was smiling in a short video. And by contrast, on the far right, you have what people probably also have seen, which is a deep fake of Tom Cruise, in which someone who looks almost exactly like Tom Cruise, speaks with almost the same voice, appears on TikTok for the first time. And the reason I'm showing this is these are really the two extremes. And it's important to understand both. So the image that is the animated single image is the directionality of travel on a lot of deepfakes, which is we need less and less data to fake an image or to manipulate an image. We can do it in easy to access apps like the app I show in the middle of the screen now, like something like Impressions or Reface. And increasingly, that's the direction of travel with deepfakes. The one on the right is kind of what we worry about a lot with deepfakes. Oh, can we pause the audio now? The one on the right is what we worry about with deepfakes, which is this idea that you'll be able to fake, you know, someone looking exactly like they're speaking. And the truth is, this Tom Cruise one took a personal, a very good impersonator. It took a very talented deepfake artist, and it took many hours probably of virtual, effects work after the video was made. So I think we have to be careful also not to obsess when we think about deepfakes with the ones on the right. We need to think about all the ones in the middle. And so what deepfakes also include are the ability, for example, to much more easily remove objects in a video, perhaps to confuse someone's OSINT or open source investigation, to manipulate someone's face to look like they're speaking along to a soundtrack. And we're certainly seeing that progressing with things like, you know, how you might falsify someone in a Zoom call. And making it look like someone acted in a way they didn't, for example, looking like someone was drunk. So I think it's important for people to think about that range of deepfake techniques as they start to think about, well, how are journalists going to handle these?
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Sam, how prevalent or widespread are these deepfakes, and what are the challenges in detecting them for journalists? Yeah,
so the most common prevalence of deepfakes, and I think it's always important to really repeat this ad nauseam, is that deepfakes are used against women. So deepfakes are used in non-consensual sexual images targeting women, both, of course, celebrities, but also ordinary women in harassment and online violence. There was a report about a year ago that said that around 96% of deepfakes that you can encounter online are non-consensual sexual images. So non-consensual both for the person who's having their face substituted into an image, and of course non-consensual often for the sex industry actor or actress who's having their body taken from them as well. That figure is a little confusing, and I think it's important to go back to this, is because recently a figure came out from one of the major app manufacturers in this space, which said that in fact that there are 3 billion deepfakes created with one of these apps. So again, as we start to think where the potential for usage comes in, it's actually now that increasingly it's easier and easier to do this within an app-like format. So prevalence of deepfakes primarily targeting women, and around 4% of women journalists reported being targeted with a deepfake in a recent UNESCO survey. A lot of growth in terms of using what are called GAN-generated images, which are like the way you create an image of someone who never existed in like fake accounts on Twitter to use in disinformation campaigns, a lot of satirical use of deepfakes. And then, you know, a growing use of what's known as the liar's dividend. The liar's dividend is this idea that you can claim anything real is fake. And we've been seeing that repeatedly. Witnesses run a process over the last 3 years of what we describe as prepare, don't panic for deepfakes, talking with journalists and fact checkers and activists around the world. And they noted this escalating use of what's always been an excuse, right, from governments and people in power, which is like, that's fake, and that's growing. And I think maybe to illustrate the challenges around detecting deepfakes, I can show another example. So if we go to slide 3, please.
I love it. What's an audio experience?
If we could go to slide 3, please. Let's pause the video here, thank you. Great, so this is a video that came out in March in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. It's the former chief minister of the largest city in the country, implicating the de facto prime minister of the country, Aung San Suu Kyi, in a corruption charge. Now, the reason I'm showing this is because the moment this video came out and it was released by the military government in Myanmar, netizens, people in the country, journalists said this must be a deepfake. because he would never say these things. He would never accuse Aung San Suu Kyi of these charges. And look at his face, right? Like his mouth doesn't quite align. His voice doesn't sound natural. And what happened, and this is sort of the trajectory of events, is very rapidly people placed this video into an online deepfake detector. And that deepfake detector came back saying it's 90% probable this is a deepfake. So if you looked online on Twitter, on Facebook, and on the local news, you'd see sort of a red box around his face. If we could go to the next slide, you'll see some illustrations of this. And in this kind of presentation online, immediately people jumped to this conclusion. And the challenge was that this probably wasn't a deepfake. So myself and others in the deepfake community, like Henry Ajda, many of the leading scientists, creators, looked at this, and we looked at the different signs, and we concluded that probably the movement on the chest didn't match the mouth, that the distortion around the mouth was probably because it was a video that was compressed. But the reason I'm telling you this story is that there were no real easy tools available to local journalists, to many international media to work out how to make this judgment. And the tools that were available were unreliable. So for example, these online detectors don't work well for a video made with one technique if you use it for another technique, right? So it's designed for one technique, doesn't work well with another. These online detectors don't work well, for example, with a video that's been compressed, like most videos we encounter on social media networks. So all of these problems around how do we think about that? And that's been really one of the things that we've been pointing to, is actually journalists are not well prepared for dealing with detecting deepfakes of this type, because we don't have the tools that are easily available, and we don't often have the skills in media forensics around them. Many deepfakes we're going to detect easily with good journalistic practice, right? We're going to look at sources, we're going to corroborate, we're going to use existing tools like reverse video search to see if there's an existing version or an existing background. But the reality is that this video, to me, sort of serves as a reminder that we are very ill prepared for a far greater range of deepfakes out in the wild, in a far greater range of global contexts where journalists don't have the skills and the tools available to them.
And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about authenticity infrastructure. It's something you mentioned in a paper you wrote for Witness on tracing trust. And I just wonder if you could explain what that term means and why does it matter?
Yeah, so simply put, you can think of, often from a technical side, you can think of two ways to detect deepfakes, so to speak, and other forms of media manipulation. One is you can apply the types of detection tools I just shared in this story from Myanmar. And we can down the slide at this point if it's okay, thank you. One of these types of tools that, but they don't have great reliability. So, in a recent very large scale process run by Facebook with a number of other allies, the best performing tools had about a 65% success rate. And that is not reliable enough for widespread usage. So detection tools are not very reliable. So the other direction people have gone in is saying, instead of trying to detect manipulation after the fact, we should build what is described as authenticity and provenance infrastructure. So these are ways much more at scale that we can track where media comes from, how it's been manipulated, how it's been edited. So kind of like show your work for media. And there's been a lot of attention around this. There's one project that came out of the BBC, Radio Canada, a number of other allies called Project Origin that really tries to sort of track the origins of mainstream media content. There's another one that came out of Adobe, Twitter, the New York Times, called Content Authenticity Initiative. And they're both under an umbrella of something, a lot of acronyms here, the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Authenticity and Provenance. And Witness has been part of those working groups. And what they're trying to do is create an infrastructure where people can choose to add in signals, where the media was created, how it was edited, so you can see what has happened over time to pieces of media and provide signals to a journalist or a consumer. Now, this isn't without complications, right? I come out of Witness's work, where we work with high-risk civic journalists and human rights activists who document often in repressive or authoritarian contexts. So we want to be really careful about an infrastructure that places burdens on people, either technical burdens, right? Like if you're in Myanmar, do you have the latest Android phone? No. Or safety burdens, right? So like, for example, if you're a citizen journalist, you may not want to put your actual identity, your specific location into a piece of media, or you may need to redact that. And that comes from a good place, not a dishonest place. So as we build this infrastructure, there's a lot of work happening in the second half of this year. We'll see some of this coming into the public sphere, we need to make sure these infrastructure are built in a way that serves journalists, right? So they can both put these signals into media they create, but also use these signals to verify and confirm that something is not being manipulated, or it has been manipulated, but it's not malicious, right? Like you can deepfake things in a non-malicious way. And at the same time, we need to make sure this doesn't disadvantage people who may not want to add lots of data to their media as they create it, because that may create risks or may disadvantage them technically or in the environment they live in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for that, overview of where we're seeing these issues arise and what we need to do to bring in these different communities, so we're not just making it something from the global north. But on that note, I think it's important to talk about the different tools that are out there, and I'd like to bring in Maria Amelie to discuss sort of her background. She's a former journalist and also co-founder of Factiverse. And she was also Norwegian of the Year in 2010 and wrote a book that actually changed Norwegian immigration law, or led to the change of that, rather. But Maria Amelie, just tell us about how Factiverse is using automation to detect fake news, with AI. And perhaps, if you want to show us a little bit more about the product, that would be great.
Hello, thank you so much that I can be part of this panel. So Factiverse started as an academic project at the University of Stavanger here in Norway, and my co-founder Vinay Sethi, he is associate professor in machine learning, and he started working he's worked with AI for more than 12 years, and one of the projects he did was to develop this sort of a web browser extension where you can so that you can easily identify a fake news article when you're searching online. So we kind of started working on this plugin, and now went out to the media, and currently trying to understand what are the real needs that the journalists have when it comes to fake news. And to your question, we use AI, but then AI is such a broad word, so it's a lot of math, and it's definitely not magic, because it depends all on the type of data that you have access to. So the prototype was created based on the data from many manual fact-checking websites, and their effort, the non-profit manual fact-checking websites, have been very instrumental in this fight against misinformation and fake news. And we just did some testing with the data they had, and trained our AI to understand better how to separate an article and a topic that is most likely labeled as false in the past, and help it to predict what it can be like a more credible information in the future. Yeah, I can show you quickly our demo, of course, if we have time. Share screen. There it is. Oh, this is, by the way, our team. We got a great support with different media organizations, and really excited about what we can achieve. So here's an example of an article, and the idea is that you are not sure about the topic or a claim, and you can mark it, and then you can analyze the marked text, and you get the result. You get most relevant and most credible sources on this topic that can help you to make a decision yourself whether that claim is true or not. And that's a bit different from, we do use Google, but it's still a bit different that the results you get from Google, it's more concentrated, and you get a list of most credible sources who have in the past has written about climate change and have been labeled as the ones that were most credible. And this is just the beginning of what we are working on. One of the things we've have realized when it comes to, so we created this, and then we went to journalists and then asked, so is it something you would like to use? And the feedback was that it's almost like journalists are offended when you ask them, do you need a tool against fake news? Because that's the core of their job, is to be able to separate the sources. However, the challenge is that they have so much to do and they have so little time, and the pressure in the newsrooms is just rising. So you have to deliver more articles, and mistakes happen often because you don't have enough time to do proper research. So it's not so much about, it's more about how to, we see that journalists need tools that can help them to do better research. In general, just like with tools or deepfakes, like Sam mentioned, is that there are not so many great tools for journalists. And that's one of the findings we see when it comes to, one thing is you can build this advanced AI, but sometimes it's just a simple issue of like understanding the context of a topic really quickly so that you can proceed further and find the most relevant sources for your article.
And I'm just curious, you mentioned that you were working with the Norwegian news agency on a pilot project, with Factiverse. How are journalists finding it? Are they incorporating it into their daily, workflow in the newsroom? What is the feedback you're getting, and how is that partnership working out?
Yeah, so the Norwegian news agency, NTB, they aim to be Europe's leading when it comes to media innovation, and they have done a lot of testing with technology, both with they have a huge metadata project where they tag basically every picture in their archives, and so that you avoid the mistake of connecting a wrong person to a wrong picture, which I think has been a really formidable project. And they also have been done some testing on robotic journalism, basically when you have some articles that are automated. And what we have done is that we've gained access to the newsroom and done lots of interviews just to understand how is it their journalists work today. And for them, it's always a challenge to be quick to publish and to be thorough. And one of the mistakes, so we started with this assumption that it's going to be that they need super advanced solutions, but what we see is that sometimes it's journalists and editors need help with analyzing an article they're going to publish and finding the simple mistakes, like it can be units or statistical numbers, and that's where we can help. More likely to help to make an impact is to avoid all the small mistakes that show up when you're trying to publish, be first to publish and quick to publish. And then the other tool we've started developing based on some of the feedback from their journalists is exactly on that. How can a journalist understand the context of a topic much faster? And NTB has a really great archive over the articles they published for the past 20, 30 years. So that's this type of access to data is really important when you're working with AI. If you don't have good data, then it's really, really difficult to create some new solutions. And yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So so I'm a journalist myself, and when I went into back to this field, but from an entrepreneurship perspective, I was appalled to find out that there are many other industries like marketing, PR, legal industry, that they all have some kind of tailor-made research tools for them. While in journalism, we kind of have accepted that what we have is Google. That's good enough. Of course, investigative journalists, they have access to some very expensive databases and they can search for information there. But like a journalist who is working day to day, delivering between 5 and 15 articles a day, what they have access to is their archives, and then they have Google, and then it's some social media. So I just think it's not the way it's supposed to be, that people who are guarding the democracy, who are helping us to bring the truth out there, don't have access to the best possible tools in order to in order to save time on research, but still create good and credible articles. So that's one of the aims we're working on, especially when it comes to text mining and research. How can I mean, if you look into the PR monitoring tools, some of them you can even it works almost like a search engine, and you can even see, you can search for a topic, and then you can see even how many emojis and what type of emojis have been used about the topic for the past month or for the past year. And I think why should a PR, not that I have anything against PR people, but why should someone on that side of things should have access, and a journalist doesn't have access to a proper tool for research?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about like what goes into Factiverse. Like, are you using deep learning to build this and the other tools?
Yes, it's text mining and it's natural language processing. So we can one of our strengths. There are many different tools, AI tools on when it comes to fake news and misinformation, and some of them use network analysis. Some of them analyze bots and the connections between them. There are also some who are basically gathering all the manually fact-checked data and then analyzing that. But some of our strengths, and we have patented this solution, is that we can analyze the context and meaning of a text. So it's not just a sentence, or we can go down to words and to see the connections between them. And we use natural language processing to do that. That's great. Yeah. And I think one of the other important aspects of this is we really need to be teaching the future journalists, of tomorrow, like how to use AI or how to understand how AI works and manage the deepfake world. And that's why I'd like to bring in Glyn, who's a former journalist and specializes in data and digital journalism. Now, Glyn, I just want to, get your perspective on this. What are the trends you're hearing in educational journalism conferences or in the data journalism world when it comes to addressing, deepfakes and helping journalists understand more about debunking mis and disinformation?
Thanks, Tara. It's a really good question. I mean, because in a way, both Sam and Maria Amelie have both kind of answered a lot of what it's about in the first place. We're seeing a lot of stuff coming up exactly as has just been said around newsroom automation, around kind of tools. And I mean, one of my favorite kind of phrases is institutional memory, where because, staff move on, we actually lose human data, and it is only in our archives that's there. So we've got to mind that. So yeah, absolutely spot on. One of the other big things that I've been seeing is around GPT-3, the text generation AI tool, and how we know that video fakes are out there. The stuff I've been seeing in the journalism education world around that hasn't sort of increased massively over the last few months, but I do wonder if that's just down to kind of all the lockdowns and the restrictions we've had. But I mean, interestingly, there was a blog post that made it to the top of, and I'm just going to check which website, sorry, Hacker News, which was entirely generated by a text algorithm. And this is one of the areas, again, as with my colleagues' work, this is one of the areas I'm quite concerned by. If people are able to just generate text really quickly and really easily in a black box system, so we don't know what's happening behind it, that's quite concerning. And what I want to do, I just want to share a couple of slides, if I may.
Sure.
So there we go. Yeah, I'm not going to do that because it's, as is typical with these things, it's brought up the dreaded Mac sort of permissions window. No, don't worry about that. So basically, I'll share this later, but what I did, I went onto a tool, and it's really interesting. It's called copy.ai. And essentially, you can give this thing a bullet list. You can just write in a bunch of phrases, and and it will generate text for you. And I kind of, with a couple of extra clicks to refine what I was doing, to select what I liked from what it did, it came up with something pretty plausible about my course. And yet it's completely untrue. I haven't done it, and I haven't generated any of it. So I think that's one of the kind of really interesting things that's doing the rounds for me at the moment. And in some ways, as with a piece on Hacker News, a lot of people were saying, well, you know, you're picking on somebody who's posting stuff. This isn't fake, it's legit. There is this, it is trust. You know, I mean, Sam was saying about tracking trust and this kind of verification side of it. And that's absolutely crucial as far as I'm concerned at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, we've heard from Sam and also Amelie how there's just really no bulletproof tool, you know, to detect deepfakes, and that they're not as accurate as we'd like them to be. And who knows if there ever will be. But I just wonder, as a professor who kind of specializes in data journalism, you know, what's your approach to teaching journalists how to develop a mindset for this and not just learning a tool? What do you think we need to do? How do you handle that?
I think that, I mean, again, I think you've absolutely nailed it. One of the big issues I've got about tools is not just that they're not perfect, it's that when funding runs out, some of them disappear, or they go to a freemium model where we can't afford to pay for the full version. So it's quite difficult. I think the key thing is just basic literacies. It's just the sort of solid core understanding. Now, one of the nice things about journalism training is actually we're working with a bunch of people who we're kind of teaching them a healthy skepticism, right from the word go, and I say it, healthy skepticism. Who's telling us this thing? Why are they telling us this thing? What do they want to get out of it? What does that mean for us? And if you kind of start then aligning that to data, so why has this data set been produced? Whatever it might be a spreadsheet ready, you know, pre-made for charting and graphing, or it might be a data set that we can run an AI model on. Why has it been produced? Why is it in the format? What's kind of coded into the guts of this thing, into the background of it, that's going to affect us? So you've got a number of kind of things to think about there. I mean, there's computational thinking, how to break this thing down into its component parts and understand it kind of at its abstracted level, its simplest level. How have the steps been put together to actually make this work? There's then kind of the whole algorithmic accountability side of things, fact checking and verifying. I mean, there's been some really good work done on that particular area, particularly around things like algorithmic sentencing or algorithmic decision making within local government and things like that. So how do we get to those base decisions? And in the previous panel, a couple of the speakers were talking about things like freedom of information. Well, if it's a civic algorithm or a civic tool, we can actually then, in some countries, use freedom of information to try and get access to that kind of initial decision-making process. So that's kind of one of the key things. I think the other one is just kind of, and again, people have been talking about it in the chat during the last session, it's removing fear. It's actually kind of trying to help people who often go into journalism because they have a love of words, a love of communication, and a love of kind of getting to the bottom of the problem. How do we enable those people to work with technologies and actually kind of make that crossover? And that might be using people's tools that have been pre-done, or it might be writing your own. I mean, I teach people how to code. It's one of the things in courses I've developed previously, and what I do now. It's helping people actually cross that boundary, kind of find that way of asking those questions, but just in a different frame. We're used to asking questions. It's what we do for a living as journalists. So to me, coding and some of the things both Sam and Amelie were talking about, I don't see those as anything other than journalism, because we're just using a different tool to do that kind of interview process, asking those questions. Who are you? What do I need to know about you? Are you telling me the truth as best as we can get it during deadlines? So yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, maybe Sam can also weigh in here, but Glyn, do you think we need more media forensics in curricula at these data journalism or even just journalism master's programs like you've taught at Cardiff University, now you're at City? I'm just wondering if both of you could sort of explain your perspective on that. Do we need to bring in media forensics more into the learning process?
Sam, do you want to go first, or do you want me to pick this one up first?
I can jump in. Excuse me. I actually have a fairly strong perspective that we do need to think about it more. I think there's media forensics has tended to sit historically with like law enforcement and in a very few elite newsrooms. I think there are multiple ways we can approach training on media forensics, though, because I think it is actually quite complex to be a good media forensics analyst. So we should be incorporating it more into training for journalists, but we should also be thinking about how we have better, what I would describe as escalation capacities within and collaboration within the journalism community. I know that's like saying one of those words that potentially raises all kinds of red flags in the real world, but that's a genuine statement that like thinking about how we escalate up, right? So like take the Myanmar case I just described. There was no way for journalists who didn't have the media forensics capacity there to find how to escalate it. I am not the right person to escalate that case to, right? I am not a media forensics expert. I was doing it on the sidelines because I had an interest in what was happening and was working in Myanmar. So we need a better escalation capacity. And then we need to think about how we do very strategic training around media forensics in journalism programs. So it's a combination of the two things, like a stronger field of expertise in that space and broader general training.
And the collaboration, I don't actually disagree with you at all on that one, quite frankly, Sam. I mean, one of the things I do is I work as well as with data journalists with investigative journalists. So we do a lot of OSINT work. My colleague Richard particularly does kind of quite a lot of work in that area. We're also we're looking at what people like Witness and Sam are doing. We're looking at people like Full Fact. There's a lot of fact-checking journalistic organizations that are springing up. And actually, as part of their mission and their way of working, they've generated some absolutely fantastic resources. I mean, I even use those with my second-year undergraduate students, let alone the masters, because I like Sam, I do genuinely believe that kind of the more young journalists understand what they're sort of facing, actually the more healthily skeptic, I suppose, they can be. But in terms of other things, I mean, there are some really good collaborations now. I mean, if you look at people like even the sort of down to a local level with the Bureau for Investigative Journalism local in the UK, the Ferret in the UK, up in Scotland, they're doing some brilliant collaborative work where they're actually working much more closely with members of communities than possibly some of the mainstream newsrooms are. So I think it is that combination of the two things, that literacy, that understanding of the problem, coupled with knowing who you can work with. And what I've seen more and more in, particularly with some of the Bureau local stuff, is that actually how they're also collaborating with kind of journalists from mainstream, I hate the term mainstream media, but I'm going to use it anyway, from mainstream media newsrooms, so local newspapers. You've also got people like the BBC Shared Data Unit, who are actively training journalists and collaborating across a number of platforms to actually help people understand these problems. So yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it is that literacy. And, I think both Sam and Marie-Amelie won't be surprised that they'll be getting an email from me about kind of next year's course. But it is that collaboration as well. To go back to your first question to me, it is difficult for universities and colleges because the pace of change is really fast. So it is this collaboration between the academy and industry that actually brings a lot in. And it's bringing in kind of specialists to help us kind of, make certain points, teach certain skills and focus on certain aspects. But I think, it adds to the student experience. It makes it more fun for the students and for the staff. but it actually really helps us kind of build skills capacity.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, it might be good to bring in some questions from the audience. Andrea, I'm just curious, how are we doing? Any insightful questions there?
Yes, thank you, Tara, and everyone for this illuminated panel that has stimulated discussion in the chat. First, we have a question from Raquel Miguel. Let me see if it appears. She asks, what should newsrooms do to avoid these threats, and what is a good investment for them to combat deepfakes? Is any one of you that want to take on this one?
I can say just one word on the preparing. I actually think one of this is understanding what is possible and what is not, and pushing back on the hype, right? So a lot of European newsrooms picked up very uncritically on the story that there was a deepfake used of Navalny's chief of staff, which when you actually saw the video was a guy in a bathrobe who looked nothing like him. And that kind of credulity is harmful, because when there are actual deepfakes, it'll harm us. And it also suggests that really there's a very limited critical capacity. So as well as the tool side that we've talked about, I think actually understanding and staying current with what you can actually do, right? It's not easy to do that. Tom Cruise deepfake now, you should know that, is really important. And having an ability to push back critically. As I said, globally, the risk we've seen most is actually this liar's dividend of people saying real footage is fake. And you do need media forensics for that, but you also need to avoid playing into the hype and the credulity. So I would start with that non-technically.
Thanks, Sam. That's some great insight. Here's hoping some newsrooms are listening now. We have another question from Jose Molina Garcia. He's wondering about the legal concerns with the methods you've mentioned, and if you have ever found any challenges in this regard.
I can probably answer here. So yeah, there are actually it's very important to have legal stuff checked, especially when it comes to text mining. And there are some companies, some fact-checking companies that has actually have had to close down because of not being transparent on where they get their data and how they mine the data. And another challenge, maybe not so much the legal, but what I've seen, especially for example with the refugee crisis in 2015, there were so many websites and initiatives, and also some tech stuff that was going on that was really on the rise, and then they lost the funding. So, but they still left their projects online there. So you kind of, it created the space with digital garbage that can also be a source of misinformation in itself, because it's not updated. And I guess that's also the challenge I see with many manual fact-checking nonprofits, is that what happens if they don't have their funding, or the funding source changes? What are the will we still be able to have access to who will be updating that important resources that they are creating? At least what if I hope it's a good enough reply on the whole legal side of it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marie. Those are some.
I think Glyn also has.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that as well. I mean, again, it goes back to Sam's previous point. I mean, legally, you've got to be careful about defamation. If you're making claims about an individual or kind of an organization, and it depends on jurisdictions how defamation laws work, obviously. But if you're basing it on a video and the decisions you've made about whether this is true or false, that's problematic. And if you just run that video as well, again, there are the kind of the defamation, let alone the ethical issues around that. You know, there's a lot of video that even has been proven to be positive, but true, that, you know, ethically, should we be showing it? So I think some of those kind of basic decisions, is it something we should share ethically, even if we can verify and fact check it, and also lawyer up. If you're in a news organization, run it up the poll, get an editor to look at it, get a lawyer to look at it. If you're a freelance, spend some more time, do the due diligence and make sure you understand what it is you're looking at.
Thank you so much, Glyn and Marie, for sharing your experience with the audience. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. So thank you, and passing it back to you, Tara.
Well, thanks everyone so much for being on the panel today. That was absolutely fascinating, understanding more about AI and deepfakes and how journalists can understand what's real. And and I look forward to the next session.